name's Richard Stephenson, as you can see from the thing. I am a transactional analyst. I'm based in Leigh-on-Sea now. I used to be based in London. My experience is I started out as a counsellor and a volunteer. And that's what first got me into culture, as you can see from my background, which I will bring today. My first job was taking people to treatment rehab centres. We noticed that not a lot of Afro-Caribbeans were entering there, even though they had drug problems. There was some research around that, and why wouldn't they doing it? And we looked at cultural aspects like food, where the places were based, like they were based out in places outside of London. So we realised these people are engaging. It really got me thinking about how accessible is treatment or therapy to some of the people that we got in our communities, you know, that are, and the mixture of culture and diversity. So that was the experience from Maya. And then from then, the volunteering, I worked as a counsellor in a probation service. I worked in the criminal justice. I worked in the day treatment centre. And now I work in a psychiatric hospital as first, and I have a various private practice where I also do a bit of clinical supervision, you know, by me. So that's my experience, and that's what I do. So I'll give you vignettes of my work. I'll give you my own experience, my own history's experience. It was really nice. Karen Minikin done it this morning because I'm doing a similar concept where I bring my family's history and background. I'm slightly dyslexic, and it brings in the theory. I use the theory from my own experience. Also, what I must say is it's not been the best of weeks for me. When I throughout my training, in my last year training, I was diagnosed with a terminal illness. You know, in the last week, I've been hospitalised, and so at the moment in time, I'm in hospital. But my inner childhood script was not to say nothing. Come on, be brave. You know, and it really took a struggle for me to sort of say, speak up and say, you know, and we're going to look at scripts and injunctions and messages later on, but not to say nothing, be strong, come on, you know. And even up until this morning, I spoke to a colleague on here and I spoke to other colleagues to say what I do. And part of it is quieting that critical parent and enhancing that child to be open and honest, you know. Because my experience was my mother died of cancer. She didn't tell me till 2 weeks before she died, which I found really painful. That's a little bit around my background, because I'm going to bring a lot of me in my workshops. There will be a lot of me, and there'll be, I can't see you all what I'm saying. If anything, if you just put your hands up in the chat, anything, we've not got a big group, feel free to do so. Okay, so it says the importance of understanding cultural scripting. For me, about scripts, and I talked about understanding the past to rewrite the future, is my second sort of heading. And underneath, I can't see if you see, I've thought about this therapy concept of intergenerational cultural influence therapy, using TA concepts in a sense to try and understand how people's cultures influence how they are. And we'll look a little bit later on at the end of it, how, you know, there's research that shows people's, I think Karen hit it on it, how their mental and emotional well-being are affected by these cultural things. Is everyone with me so far? Okay. So our journey together today. So the first thing I'm going to look at is cultural influences. One thing I look at is a culture within a culture. I won't go too much into it, but it'll explain as it goes on. And how I may explain that is my own culture. My mother came here in the 1950s, you know, and the big Caribbean culture in Brixton. And so we moved into a culture of another culture around us, which is dominantly a white culture. How the culture in a culture survives, how scripts come out of that culture. We're going to look at cultural identity and the importance of our cultural identity and knowing where you come from. I'll look a little bit of history. I didn't know, you know, if you think about us as Afro-Caribbeans or Africans originally, I can only trace my culture back so far. My identity from there has been eradicated and has been changed, you know, so I only have a sense. I only have what I'm going to talk about later is the unconscious ghosts that may come through or the messages that my parents may have given me throughout that process. We're also going to look at a model I thought around cultural expectations and how they put pressure on the person and their identity, you know, and the difficulties with that and the struggles with that throughout someone trying to find identity, trying to find who they are, or making no sense of them. So I've used a lot of TA concepts to make sense of this. Identity, autonomy, my two biggest things, and how do people have an identity if they don't know where they come from? This morning was really interesting because I'm along that similar thing around displacement, and the displacement of my culture. I've worked with two other cultures quite closely and I've put them into this workshop, and how displacement creates that confusion in identity and who you are. Some people, they try and eradicate it. Byrne himself was Jewish and he changed his name, which I found out in training, which is interesting. And I've worked with the Hasidic Jewish community. It's interesting how they are with their, because they could fit in and change their name, but they don't. They actually make themselves stand out. So we'll look at interesting concepts of that. And then also I talk about cultural contaminations and injunctions, which we sort of know about. I won't go too much into, or look at some theories around contamination, injunctions that I found. They're not set in stone, it's just my theories from experience. And also an important thing I talk about is intergenerational cultural messages, trauma, beliefs. And I've thought of this thing, which is interesting, called invisible cultural chains, that have been handed down throughout generations. And we'll look at them a little bit more in depth. And then lastly, in the second part of this workshop, I'm going to look at how do you work individually. There's no use making sense of the beginning without looking how can we use this individually as psychotherapists and impact. So we can look at cultural personality adaptations, the full self, the cultural protective self in two specific things. We're going to look at adaptations in personalities and how they may transform. And through that, I'll give vinaigrettes to clients who I have. And then we'll look at the impact on emotional health, I said on the end of it. So hopefully that it. And there will be, because I know 2 hours is a long time for me to rant on and go on. So there will be a break when I'm going to ask, it will come along, we do a break when I'm going to ask some certain questions. You'll go into breakout rooms, and then in rooms, it'll give you time to think about and process some of the stuff I talked about this morning. Any questions with that on this chat? Turning off. Okay, fine. Okay, I hope that's straightforward. It should make sense as we go along. Okay, next one. So I talked about a culture with a culture earlier on. It's really important to, and I found this picture, it talked about complex multi-ethnic cultures. I'm going to explain this in my own history as a child growing up. So think 1960s, she painted a picture of Karen Miniken, 1960s in England. So in my house, we ate prominently Caribbean food, rice and peas, jerk chicken, stuff like that. Nowadays, it's all over the telly. You see there's books, there's stuff. In the days, there was no experience outside of my culture in home. We had a sense where my mum talked Caribbean in the home. It's really interesting, We all talk Caribbean. And then we go out into our master culture we talked about, where there was fish and chips. We went to school, there was liver and stuff. There was all these different foods that you had when you went to school. So you had all these different foods, taste and outside, and these different smells, and it's a totally different culture. And so we think about subcultures within cultures. And it was really embarrassing for me at times to say to my friends, to tell them to come home, because I think, would they be embarrassed? Would they eat this food? Because I'd have people at school talking about, jungle bunnies and the food. It was really quite painful. So there was this fear of being rejected. I always talk about, and I've worked with different cultures where you get culture with cultures, where the culture keeps themselves, and they keep parts of their culture for protection. They're fearful of being annihilated. So they're not showing that part of culture to the outside world. Over the years, that has changed. led in the last few years it's changed, you know. I was really interested in that.
Dad is gonna make all the pies.
Okay. Oh, I can hear some background. Can we go on mute if people, please?
Apple pie. Sandwich. Ooh,
Hello? I just hear someone, says everyone put themselves on mute because I don't know if I can do it. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay. So yes, the cultural script is a mechanism for survival, White talked about. So I said that is keeping you adapt and you change your culture to survive, you know, especially some of the cultures that I talked about, you know, that have been persecuted. I'm going to talk about the Bangladeshi community. I'm going to talk about the Hasidic Jewish community, and especially the Afro-Caribbean community. All have been persecuted, all have been displaced at some times in their life, you know, so their script is really important to support them. So a person may live within the scripting by making modest changes. It talked about, Frank Hurst really said, and we talk about these modest changes in order to survive and to develop. And my mum done it in a sense. You know, we have this really weird thing at home where my mum would be talking deep Caribbean and the phone would ring. And on the phone, she'd speak perfect English. You know, this beautiful English voice would come out, she'd put the phone down, and the Caribbean voice would come back down. You know, so it was really interesting how the concept come out. So there's three aspects that made me think of cultures, you know, and the importance of cultural identity and how do we hold that? And coming from an Afro-Caribbean background, how do we living in England, how has it enabled me to understand the importance of integration into cultures in order to survive in a hostile environment at times? Aaron put that thing out, and I clearly had that, you know, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. You know, I clearly remember that as a child and having to live in houses where there was just, you know, I think we had Irish landlords or black landlords, and we lived up in the rooftops of them, you know. And I sort of laugh at people where we had rats in the bread bins and stuff like that. But they were all run down houses in Brixton in the 1960s, you know, because everyone, I learned some history of what happened in Brixton. They were quite affluent houses. And then through the affluent houses, what happened during the war, people moved out. So there's a lot of derelict houses at times. So because of the Caribbeans moved in, and so these landlords took them over, and then they were, you know, so they took them over, and so they rented them out to undesirables as such. They knew they could rent them. So I looked at the importance of cultural identity. My family are from Barbados, but since I've learned that my great-great-grandfather is white Welsh, which is important to know. So I understand, and later on that'll transpire, I may understand the split internally inside of me when we talk about a split. You know, how I've got the deep Caribbean part of me, but I've also got a white part of me, and how that may played out of how I was able to integrate into this culture. You know, we talked about understanding ingrained beliefs, values and behaviors that are being introduced to you from your parents and how they might have influenced me in life and who influenced me in my practice now, which are really important. I talked about the background. So I talk about the importance of heritage and who am I. How do I know who I am if I don't know where I come from? This is a really important concept of identity. And if you think with the African community, we was taken from a land, you know, we had all these cultures and things. Half the times they went underground, they were hidden, you know, like the pattern of hair, stuff like that. You know, the only way sometimes we could keep our culture through songs, and that's why a lot of singing, you know, sings. And we was allowed to do that as a sense to keep us happy. Think about the importance of heritage. Some people here, they may know their heritage. I don't know if they do, but they'd probably be able to go back their heritage and go back hundreds of years as such, you know, and go back centuries for us. As Africans, our heritage was cut off. We was taken from an island, we was brought to a new place, and what happened, our identity and who we are was discredited, you know. So if you think about individuals and culture sitting in a room, how difficult is that for them? You know, if they don't know who they are, how are they going to be able to engage with you and make sense of that? Next, talk about cultural shock. It's really an interesting concept I looked at, and I got this. This was from a theory. Ian a Cup's site in Pedersen, where he talks about the stages of cultural shock. So we talked about, can you imagine the 1960s? You know, and just picture it. You know, I'm going to give you an exercise. You can think of it. But my parents come in here, come into this cold country first of all. My mother going outside, getting abused. You know, being ridiculed, but saying that she'd be welcome at first. And then the cultural shock happened. They got the signs up there. So there's no Irish, no blacks, no dogs. This was all written on doors. You know, and so imagine that, having to adapt to that hostile environment. And it was really interesting because as a child, I saw this, my mother going out and she'd take us as kids and she'd be really pleasant to the people she walked along. And then there was this split. We know about splits in psychotherapy. And then she'll come in and she'll be cursing the same people, you know, and there'll be this thing, you know. So it was really important. And I'd be confused. You know, we talk about the confusion, the internal split inside. Well, why is she being friendly to these people? But she comes inside and she says how to dislike them. What I talk about then is the adaptation to survive, you know, and survive in the bigger culture. And later on, I talk a little bit around the fear of annihilation, you know, the fear of being got rid of, is really important to think of, you know. So, it's important to hold these concepts times when we talk about the importance of your cultural identity and knowing it. The next one itself is identity itself, you know, and plays an integral part of who I am and how I feel and how I developed into a TA psychotherapist. You know, Hagen-Seal's cultural module explained this, which considers the concepts of cultural aspects of self as part of an individual sense of identity. And what I mean by that is, by your identity, you've weaned that into who you are. Imagine, I know there's parts of therapy that talk about a rejection of a part of self. So imagine me having to reject the black part of me. How would that put me in that? And I have beautiful examples of that. You know, I hanged around, as my experience as a child, with National Front skinheads who saw I accepted. I don't know how it happened, but I found myself as people, and there was concepts of you're all right, you know, but the others ain't. So you can think about how painful it is. And I didn't realize as a child at the time, I really just wanted to be accepted. I wanted to be a part of, you know, and I was willing to eradicate a part of me just to be fitted into the culture, you know. So these are really concepts that I think about, you know. And we talked about the development of the cultural aspects of self. And I talked about the identity earlier, and how can you create an identity then when you're getting part of your identity? So it leads me on to another important part. Identity and autonomy, these are two biggest components. And so I looked at, in my own access, I called it a glass box analogy. So imagine being a glass box and the world's running around you with all these people. You know, so you can sort of hear them and they can hear you slightly, but it feels like you're shut off from others, you know. And I felt like this a lot of my times in life growing up as a child. You know, there was stuff going on. I explained to someone really interesting factors once of going to being around my friends, you know, because for me, I hanged around with predominantly white individuals, white friends, and because there was this need to, you know. And in the time, even though in the 60s there was a lot of blacks, but some of the schools you went to were predominantly white, you know. And so I found if I attached them, there could be acceptance. I could try and fit in, you know. And my mother gave this unconscious message about fitting in, being part of, don't get rejected, you know. And I think that was from her little child ego state, being accepted. We got to fit in here. This is the last hope for me, you know. And my mother had her own history, of stuff that went on, that she left Barbados. She never talked about it, you know. I only found out that I had a grandfather when I went there in 2010. So she had this history of being silenced, you know. I talked about the changing voice and adapting. For me, it was Cockney, you know, and I sort of stayed with my English voice. Nowadays, I accept my patois and my way of speaking patois because it's part of my culture, you know. Or similar friends who are white, so it isn't just Caribbeans. I had a friend who I worked with for a while at a pub, and I remember going home with this once, And all of a sudden he came out with a Scottish accent. And I was amazed. How he just came out with Scottish accent. And it's interesting. It's really sad to think that you have to lose part of you. You can't be like that for a fear of fitting in. So I talked about repressing the parts of the identity that may be directed. This deep fear of annihilation, and there's theories around it, and how cultures have adapted or changed themselves. It's interesting because this is just a developing theory, and I thought about concept to me because I couldn't have hidden my blackness then. It was really interesting. Somehow unconsciously, I must have forgotten about it at times in the people that I hanged around with. And then I thought about the Asiatic community that I worked with, where some people adapted, didn't they? Like Byrne changed his name. Some people changed how they look. If you think of the deep Acidic community, how they enhance that look more, where their fear of annihilation, they wouldn't care about it. They showed who they are. They went out of, So it was really interesting when I think about identity, how some people hid their identity. Some people made their identity more. So they actually showed who they are and the autonomy. I think about that sadness. I couldn't get rid of my blackness. I couldn't get rid of it. And it was sad because growing up, there was a woman in Kenton who used to paint, and you'll see it, she used to paint herself white, and ride her bike and speak really English and dress in typical English clothes. And it's really sad. At the time, people laughed at her, they ridiculed her, this poor woman, and I could see how, her wanting to belong had impacted her mental health, and who she was. And it was quite sad. I talked a little about the rejection of old culture and food, and it's quite sad. I used to, I worked with a big Bangladeshi community. I remember as a child and being around people, and because they couldn't hide their food. I don't know what happened with us, but we was able to hide the spices somehow. With the Indian culture, their spices would sit on them. I remember hearing them being ridiculed at school and how sad it was, and just being there having to be quiet, and having to be silent, and it really impacted me, growing up in these times, And so then I thought about the benefits of these behaviors, and it enables the individual to adapt and integrate successfully. But the negative aspects of this is they would need to suppress or disassociate a part of their cultural identity in order to survive, if that makes sense. So there's a compromise. So to be in the bigger culture, you have to lose part of you, and there was a sadness. It's only the last few years that I've really got into the sadness of that and contacting that, and really how I'm trying to change that into my children, and trying to make sense of it, and trying to help them. Okay, is everyone okay? Any questions? Feel free to put your hand up. I like mine to be interactive, and if I'm speaking too fast or going too much along, please do let me know. Okay, the next one's a little thing that I thought about, and I thought about the cultural expectations, So I sort of drew this diagram up, and it was based on, I liked Hargett and Sills. They had some really interesting concepts around culture and that, and there's loads of Pell Drager, I think it is, we talked about the grandfather cultural script, and we thought the development itself. So I thought of this model, if you can see, I've got the blue line outside, and that you would see is the culture that you moved into. So we say that for me, it would have been the British culture and the cultural expectations to be accepted. So to speak English, to eat certain food, to behave a certain way. The only struggle was I couldn't change my color, but there was certain things to do it. Then I had the cultural invisible change I start to mention here. And so from my own culture, my own history, my own Caribbean history and how we are and the messages that are received and how they put pressure, the cultural of origin, your parents, your ancestors. We have things like a thing called a nine night, 9 days after a burial, and these things would talk to you, certain words and phrases that we use, and the expectation to be. It was a big thing, and I put in here, it was really sad because my parents sort of came here, and I understand now my parents with this around schooling and understanding. On a deep level, if you think about Afro-Caribbeans, there was if you think about reading and writing, it just really became powerful for me in education. So if you think, going back to slavery, you could be killed for reading and writing, it would be there. And I talk about these unconscious messages, and a little later on, I talk about, if we think about psychotherapy and the deeper things and the messages, they may not be verbal handed down, but these messages is handed down unconsciously into the individual. If you think about my parents and preparing me for school and education, you know, the best I got from my parents was to sit down, behave yourself, get a job in the council, any organization, any big organization, and you will survive. I realize that's what they've done because that's what they've done. It's really sad when I think of my stepfather. My stepdad worked for the post office. I used to hear, he used to say, my mum was really proud. Daddy worked for the post office. So I used to think it may be a British engineer as such. And it's really sad. I went with him on Sunday and he was a cleaner, and he was a cleaner for all these years, for like 30 years. But the sadness in it, and I think of his ego states, how he couldn't step up and say, I could be something else. And I recognize it limited me a lot. If you think about these invisible cultural chains, if you think about the messages around reading, you could be killed for reading and writing, stepping out, another aspect was around dogs. I'm not going to say this is through the card, but a lot of black people I know are really frightened of dogs, or if they do have dogs, are kicked out on the side. If you think back historically, how was slavery contained? Dogs would call to chase you, and you escaped. They would keep you under control. I went to Brixton the other day to Morley's, a shop. We've got a big department store, and they're allowed to take dogs in. And now I've got a dog with my daughter. So we took the dog up to the floor where they used to have the toys, and the person who was working there was terrified. You could see her. She was running. She knocked boxes over. Literally terrible. I felt sorry for her. And then you could see and I said, I'm looking for the toy department. You can see the distress go once she went to me. Oh no, it's downstairs now. And I thought about that, and I thought, how is someone so terrified? And I've had people, experiences I've talked about people. So I'm just showing you how this sits in a person's psyche. And I sort of drew this model where we've got parent, adult, child, and I used a little bit where you can see the development itself, in the C1, that development itself, and how the messages have been placed in there. And I call them the cultural invisible change. These are beliefs, these are behaviors, these are messages that have just been planted in there, and they only get access in times of stress. And so when we look at this, and I make all this up, and I look at someone's identity and autonomy, and they're, because you think about choice, if there's a deep, somewhere a seed in me that's frightened of reading and writing, I'm going to struggle at school. For me, I'm dyslexic, and it's really weird. It was only in my TA training, and that difficulty, because I've had friends, and this, go into a little bit about training as a psychotherapist, and I think somehow, how does it set us up to fail? Especially as a Black person, or people of culture from different cultures, working class. How does these set us up to fail? The forefathers were majority middle class. So you've got to think about that. And then with the cultural messages around reading and writing, I struggled. So I had this lecture at school. No one thought about it. I'd done my first degree. I managed to do the essays. I got to my TA training, the dissertation. I struggled. I ended up crying, literally crying, going, what are they doing to me? I can't give them what they need. I actually admitted I was dyslexic. I got wrapped. Through that, I blossomed, on my oral. And then I've got a distinction on my oral. I could explain the theory and reading it down. So excuse my model if it isn't clear, So just giving you a sense of a development of the new cultural self on how that is and what's needed to bear. So we've got the external pressures from your own culture and the external pressures from the new culture that you're in. And so think about your clients when they're well, or cultures, and think about how that impacts them, and how you can allow them to bring themselves into the room, therapy room. The next one, I'm going to look a little bit about TA theory, and I'm going to look at contamination, which is really important, and I'll give my own experience in this. You know, I hang around, as I said, it's really, as a child, it was really weird, but I had these skinhead friends, you know, and would sort of like that, because I like, they were wearing, they listened to reggae. They had these two-tone trousers, they had these braces, they had these really nice Ben Sherman shirts, and they had Crombies, all stuff that come from the Caribbean. I realized that. I knocked about them. And sort of like the message for them was, you're not like the others, Esme. You know, you're all right. It's really sad half the time. You know, they just go, you're all right. You're not like them other ones. I don't know what's different from them. It's really confusing. I got that bit of contamination. And I also got the contamination from my mother that they don't like you. You know, these people don't like you. You know, they don't like us in their country. They shout and they holler at us. They belittle us. So this is really confusion if you think of a person's sense of self and who they are in their adult component, you know. And so working with cultures now, I try to understand these two different messages, you know, and try and system to take components from each culture without, whilst maintaining a sense of self. And what I'm going back to earlier when I talked about how there's this split, you know, fouling out on my training, there was a lot of talk around split, the good or the bad, and how you embrace the two. And a lot of my work with my clients has been, how do I allow them to embrace postpartum? Because we have these cultural messages that have been handed down from parents, you know, from siblings, you know, from the people around us, you know. And this can even happen. I've had like European clients who I've worked with, you know, and I had a sort of female client lately who I've been working with, and so like was working with her difficulties with her family. She was a substance misuse user that had stopped, and now she's having difficulty. And what happened, we worked out, her family's come from a nomadic tribe. And what happened, they'd moved here. So she had adapted into her English culture, become quite well. And then she'd married this Englishman. And now with that substance issue, she was in this house. And what happened through this process of the house, her parents would have this open door policy, you know, where they'd come and she had other, because she had this big massive house, others would stay, and it started to become uncomfortable. And we started looking at her cultural history in a sense and made sense of it, you know. And then she could see what was happening, how she was not listened to, not heard. And so we was trying to make sense of it. And we see how a lot of the substance was used to shut up the part of it that said this shouldn't happen. You know, she couldn't find the compromise, you know. So it's just an example of what happened. So when you're thinking, think about the cultural contamination there from the new culture and from the old culture, and how you can make a client make sense of it. Okay, so injunctions, I'm looking at, I worked with the Bangladesh community for quite long. And I was thinking of what injunctions I had. And with the Bangladesh community, for years I sort of worked with this community, and we opened the treatment center for them. But funny enough, the hard to reach population, they didn't engage. You know, they didn't attend, they didn't come in there, you know, and we had really difficulty. So I used to go over and sit and talk to them. And what I used to do, I didn't talk to them and getting them in. I didn't try to assess them. I threw my assessments away. And what I just started talking about them, who they are and what they are. And they got a great sense. I realized that this don't belong. There was messages like they're brainwashers. Why would I go over there and do this thing? It won't fit my religion. So I got a great sense where I said with this Bangladeshi community how they don't belong. You can see that from the country, from, you know, I'm looking at a little bit at their history now and how the separation of the country. So it sort of makes sense. With Afro-Caribbean, it's different, Ramon said. I got this great thing in Don't Be Proud. And I got a really sad story of my mother. As a child growing up, I was a really good footballer. She never came. She never saw me once. There wasn't a mention of it. You know, at the end of my and I don't know if it's because of how we was treated through slavery. If you think for years, we was disempowered, was made to bow down, be small. You know, so there is this thing of being proud, you know. And I've got examples of, I remember someone opening a Caribbean restaurant years ago and it tightly failed. And I'd hear all the other Caribbean, who's he think he is? Who's he think he is to open a restaurant? You know, so there's this great thing. The story of my mum comes out in the end. She died years ago now, like 30 years. And when I went into her room, guess what I found? I found every newspaper cutting. I found every medal, every cut, everything in my football she had kept, you know, but she couldn't tell me that at the time. It's really painful to hear that, you know. We've also got this big thing of be strong. And so if you look at that, be strong drivers there, to survive on a boat, you know, to be taken from your country, to survive on a boat where thousands have died, begin to another country, it's there, you know. And even today, if you think about it, I didn't want to tell you that I've got a terminal illness. I'm in hospital, you know, my mother, and I see that thing. I'm not going to say that is everyone, but I'm going to say it's a did. And then the Hasidic community Jewish I've worked with, I haven't really expanded on it, you know, but I worked with them for 5 years, setting up a group therapy. And it was really interesting to see their culture. And there was these big injunctions around don't be important, which, you know, because there was some really, you know, significant. I've had clients who you can tell because they all dress the same. You've got clients who are really, they're not like the British community where you see where people show their wealth. You know, these people have wealth. You know, they all dress the same. You know, and even outside the community, there is a big thing around don't be important. And there's also this thing around please others, you know, which I grant. They're just some of the injunctions and drivers I've got. So when you're working individual cultures, think about their injunctions and drivers. You know, lastly, I put a British one down. I didn't actually find this myself. You know, there's no fault with this. I actually went to my supervision group and my supervisor reflected, why didn't I think about this? We think about the English and we think about that don't feel and the stiff upper lip. You know, thank you. We talked about the stiff upper lip and how that is and the don't feel. If we think about a culture, you know, I'm having a bit of empathy for now, who took over so many countries. How could you feel with taking over so many situations? You couldn't be sitting in feelings while you're taking over another country or thinking them. You had to dehumanize them. You had to make them something different. You know, so I think the English have a massive, you know, don't feel injunction if we look at PA and we go back. And there's probably more to come out of that. This was just my own fault. This theory is just me developing through my work over 20 years of working with individuals, you know, from my own experience. Okay, this was really nice. I was working with a client and we were talking about, you know, we talked about the chains of slavery, you know, and I talked about culturally invisible chains, intergenerational culture. These are the stuff that you may not understand or may not even know that's happened in your culture. Sometimes our family's historical, cultural, and generational trauma can manifest itself in the here and now. I gave you examples of the dog, you know, rage and anger. You know, it's plentiful of experiences that you had, how it manifested itself in the here and now. You know, the rejections of others. We was talking around how the rejection of others sometimes, you know, there's a comedy thing called Miss Jocelyn, if you ever watch it. And she works in an office with white people. And what happens when another black person's in, she sort of recoils, she pushes herself away, you know. I've done that myself. You can see that painful experience. And I suppose that's the painful experience of slavery when you think, when they caught the other slave, how you had to distance yourself. You know, if we think on a deeper level, how mothers had to distance themselves from their children. They knew the children were going to take away and they put in fields. Also, another invisible change I talk about, you know, not pushing blame. If we think about in the 1970s, there was a big thing around black parents, just baby fathers and becoming baby fathers and single parent children. But I also looked at the history. If you look, it's history of research. That what happened with the slave masters, built up this stock, they took the males and they made them breeders. You know, they made them breeders. And I thought about, you think about in the Caribbean as much, people were quite low. You know, my mother sort of separated, but she went with different parents, but she sort of left. There was none of that having all. But there was a sense, actually. Now I'm confused because she had 8 children, having different children. We talk about coming to the mother country and how this transcended in the second generation. They hadn't experienced slavery. You know, they were miles away from it. If you think of my generation, but throughout, you think of this having a child and then moving on and having another child. You know, it goes on quite a lot, and how painful that process. You just recreated what was done hundreds of years to you. You know. So I talked about this being a painful process for all involved. Therefore, it's important we increase our awareness to hinder this process and becoming transgenerational trauma. And how it explained to this is my children, you know. They don't want to hand down. My mother never talked about what happened to her. She suffered physical abuse. I suffered physical abuse from her. If I look back, it was the slavery beatings. They'd make you go and get the weapon and beat you. I don't mind swearing. It's physical. My trauma from it. I'm still in therapy today. The painful experiences that my anger and rage, from others with that. I'm not afraid to say, I had anger. I got into fights. It amazes me when people say they never got into fights. I don't know how they never done it. I had so much rage in my child ego state, around being hurt and hurting others, and I understand now how this was handed down. The emotional making you get the weapon, the emotional then beating you the weapon. Can you imagine how these are the cultural invisible chains I'm talking about that have been handed down, and what happens? Transfer them onto the individuals that you go, and other cultures would do the same. I don't know what the different ones are, but there's loads of research. If you look at intergenerational trauma, how research has been handed down, my belief is if you don't bring it into the awareness, what doesn't get spoken about, a simple saying, gets acted out. I always say that to my clients. So it's really important that you start to understand these cultural invisible chains, how they manage themselves in beliefs and behaviors and thoughts. We go back. Okay. So the next one, I've really looked at the cultural constant excluded ego states. We talk about, and there is some discussion because my supervisor is really saying she questioned one thing, and these are the only people that I work with, and I thought about what ego state may they stay in, and the reasons being why they stay in them ego states, and I thought about the Hasidic Jewish community. For me, there was a parent of ego state, so there was a sense to them. We talk about in CA, talk about maybe an ego state they accept to, and I thought the parental. If you think about their persecution during the war, a lot of them took into the parental stance, didn't they, hiding others, or even another parental stance, getting rid of others to save themselves and preservation. What's it called? The oxygen mask. I have to forget about you to put on the oxygen mask. So we think of that parental state, and I see that with that community as well. They have their own banks, in their community. It's really interesting. They don't go to outside banks. They act as this parental thing to take care and look after themselves and keep it all in house. The Bangladeshi was a little bit more difficult, but I seem to think there was this adult, I'm not going to say it was clear, but at times when I worked in the community experiences where individuals would go out and get their family members substances in order so they stay in the house so they wouldn't, it was adult logic to them. I don't want this going out and getting into trouble. So if I get the drug for them, they can stay in her. It was just adult logic. There was no emotional connected to it, So I thought a lot about them, and I thought maybe something about adult. With the Caribbean, I clearly see our child ego state being small, not stepping above the parapet, not wanting to get killed off, not wanting to get beaten, So I thought about these cultural, I call them constant excluding ego states, and what ego state we may say in only at a time. And these ego states I made in the reading, it was important to recognize they come in when you're under stress or trauma. So you stick back into it, and if you think of Afro, and we talk about us being angry all the time, and I recognize it now, and anger usually, I think anger is appropriate. You can be appropriately angry where you can communicate it. If you think of rage as childhood anger, unrepressed anger, you can see that, the top two ego states are gone. You're stuck into that part. So I was really interested in that ego states and finding one for cultures as you go along. Okay, my next part, I talked about cultural stance. And where do we start as a cultural stance? How are we? Is it? Think about the English community, and it's really interesting. There's this this I first, and you get that quite a lot, because it's interesting when I've looked at when I went to Bali, and it's really nice because I went there. We went to this complex, and like the grandfather has the biggest house. There's a and the Bangladesh community like that. They all come over, they buy a house for each other usually. And then once they've got the first house, then they save the house for the second. And it was really sad to think about my own community, and there's a fragmentation in the Caribbean community. And then when I think historically around slavery, you had to, there was, you was forced to tell on each other, you was forced to discount each other, and I think about that fragmented self and such. I thought our cultural stance to the all three, the English community, I would say would be an I, about me, what I can get. If you think it's a certificate, the community, because they all help each other. I was really fascinated being in the community. How someone said they're going to buy a house, and the community got together and helped them buy the house. You know, in my community, you'd ask that, and I would have laughed. They sit in the house and be proud, even family members, and they show you what they've got. I've got family members who got houses in Barbados who tell me they've got 3 or 4 houses. They've offered it to me. And then when I've asked, there's been, oh, it's not ready or it's not thing. So it's been really interesting thinking about cultural stances and how they play out in different cultures. I sort of like my sister said, we are family, because I think it's really, empty communities are really family. I'm not to saying the other two aren't, but I think sometimes somebody gets lost, and going back, especially at time of stress, because that's when the true colors come through. We know if our clients are distressed, that's when the disorders, the personality activations come forward. Okay, I did this. You won't know about this, but in the Caribbean, we have a thing we call Duppy, their ghosts. A friend of mine, a really good friend, got me introduced in a paper called, the bottom one, it's called The Intergenerational Transmission of Parental Influences. And it talked about the unconscious influences. The Indians talk about it, how they hand down through generations. These are the ghosts that come down. It's really funny because I remember growing up as a child, they'll talk about the ghosts of the Caribbeans and they'll talk about these people and come from. And I believe that our ghosts from Caribbeans, if we talk about these cultures, and I talk about the culture trying to keep you safe. So we're going to look at these messages and how be small, be quiet, don't make a fuss. They're to keep you safe, but they limit you. So they are there for the good and they're there for the bad. I remember I watched a program really interesting the other day. It's fascinating. These psychologists, and they talk about these children before the age of 7, and they'd bring up, they'd be their parents' parents in a sense, talking about things that they shouldn't have known of. I truly believe as psychotherapists, we've got to think about that. What has been laid into this person? If we go back to the egg scenario, the grandmother's having the eggs, and so thinking about that in concept. So these papers are really helpful to me to think about that and to think about your client. What doses do they bring into them from their culture and history that they may not even know? And how can you create a space to enable them to bring that forward and talk about, if that's interesting. So I was really fascinated about these papers. I just think when I'm in the room, it's something around dance, and there's something I want to talk about, a shared language, in the second part of the thing. And it's really important to sort of recognize that I understand that what ghosts have they brought into me, thinking of my own history in slavery, the persecution, the oppression, they talk about that, And okay, so I've got someone in here who seems to be really engaging in treatment, but is he just being suppressed? Is he really bringing the true sense of him? Can he feel he can? And how allow him to do that in the thing? How they create a space to that? How do you create a shared space with this culture? I found myself, it was really interesting in the Hasidic Curate. I ran a group for 5 months. I remember I must have climbed myself so much. I remember, because even in that community, you have someone who's still orthodox, but they're slightly different. So a lot of my clients were all the black and the white. I had one who would wear a different coloured shirt, this one. And one day he said to me, well, I'm the only different person in this group, and I'm part of the group. And I said, well, what about me? And he sort of thought about it, and he said, well, you don't count in as such. And I said, that's interesting. I am part of the group and I'm different. In the first instance, I'm black, so I'm of a totally different colour. I haven't got curls. And I don't wear black and white, and I'm not from your community. And it was interesting to see how somehow I'd been forgotten about in the community and fitted in, and the ghost of that. Okay. So there's intergenerational cultural messages that I thought was really important. Sorry, my nurses are just checking that I'm still alive. intergenerational cultural messages and how they are, and they're that you go back to like, I'm okay, I'm not okay. There's someone called Bats, and we talked about the internal unconscious bias I talk about in a therapeutic relationship, and in all our relationships. Think about how that we may say we haven't, but if we think about generationally, I've just brought in, we think about our ghosts. So you think about being British and you think about colonization, you know, and I done a workshop once, and I know there's been, and I introduced, well, I didn't introduce, but if you think about the blue-eyed, brown-eyed messages, and then there was experiments where they showed pictures. If you think about over history, black kettle, funerals of black, you think of these messages that have been handed down for years and put in this. You think historically, if you're British, it's been handed down for you as a child. You know, there was no really black presenters of that. And then you think you've got it unconsciously, even though you've adapted, and then you've brought that, then you've got your client, say a black client coming to you, you think he's off. So you've got their ghosts, you've got their ancestors in the room. You think of the internal battle, you know, so we think about that bias, we think about that bias in the world, you know, lately with the Joy Floyd things have come to fruition. You know, I think everyone's been traumatized, not by this, but over the generations of what's happened through slavery, you know, through, I think, Karen talked about the German and how they took over countries and how you have to make them bad. So you think about that in generation, we think about that message, and it's all there, it's in the ethos, you know. I don't think we give it enough credit at times. Well, for me, I never first started developing as a therapist. I don't give it enough credit, you know, and I think it's important that we start giving it the credit that it's needed now. Mm. So, and he took back talks about these feelings. They manifest themselves all too often in a variety of behaviors, including implicating other types of dysfunctional rescuing, avoidance of contact, denial of important potential insightful cultural differences, you know. So they sort of get avoided, they sort of get missed, they sort of get not talked about, you know. And I thought it's so important to recognize this, you know. I'm going to bring another vinaigrette. I've got this beautiful, I've got a client for all my clients are beautiful in a sense, but I've got a really nice client been working with. We've talked about these invisible chains. And what happened, he tried to get therapy. He's never been in therapy before. He's an Afro-Caribbean male of about, he's 57, similar background, so close to backgrounds, you know, but our histories are so thin. To bring into context, there's these things around in general messages where I'll bring my own experience about carrying a bag. I remember when I first started training, I had this thing about bringing a bag, and I needed to bring bags of papers. And then it didn't work out. One day I was sitting in therapy, I remember as a child, I don't know if anyone in there is Afro-Caribbean, but as children, we used to go shopping with our parents on a Saturday. We'd leave the house at 9 o'clock. We wouldn't go until 5 o'clock. And what happened, they make us carry these bags. So there was this unconscious process of carrying the bags. And I realized what had happened in my child ego state. There was this thing. I'm never going to carry a bag. I'd made a decision, a scriptural decision years before. And I had to challenge that, you know, for the best of me. And working with his clients, he had similar messages, you know, there were similar messages, similar backgrounds around how he was, you know, and he'd made decisions of not beating his child. But it was working through this, and the ability for me, just having that in mind, that experiences of him, you know, he talked about similar experience about football. His parents never taken him, telling him it was silly, just getting a job at spaces, you know, how that impacted him. And him saying to me that he would really struggle, you know, have that with conversation, maybe a white therapist, you know. And I'm not saying that may not happen further down the line in these early experiences. So we think about the oppressed and the oppressor, you know, and what you're saying, the oppressor to bring stuff to you. As you think about the example I was giving you with the Caribbeans going into treatment, you know, a lot more going in now and getting into recovery. And I know that myself. Also in therapy, I'm really sad at my hospital, hardly any, you know, I think I've had about 4 Black Afro-Caribbean clients that come to me. You know, it's really difficult. In America, it's a lot more. In England, it's really difficult for them to come in, you know. And not even just that, it's about class and culture as well. I come from a council estate, you know. If you talk about my council estate, I'm not afraid. Yet the what people achieve to is either become a drug dealer or end up in prison. You know, there was two big accomplishments. The odd person who got laughed off who said, I'm going to get a job here, there, and now. You know, I think I can't really say one or two, you know, or you could become a footballer, and that was it. There was nothing else, you know, not to become a doctor, not to become a lawyer. There was none of them experiences. So I'm saying that is very limited. So with this client, it was around working through them limitations, them intergenerational cultural messages that are there, and recognizing that you've got 400 years of this, you know. So even if you go, like, I'm going to go back to him, he's become a black cab driver. He talked about years in, he wouldn't get his own business. He really struggled, you know. And for working with me, it's really funny. He's gone to get his own cab because even becoming a black cab driver, what he done was he rented a cab, you know. And for our work together, he's saved now. He's getting a cab, and I'm just giving you a vinaigrette work of him, the change that could come forth by talking about that stuff, by him understanding of the 400 limitations from his ancestors and from his parents, you know, and the impact that has on his development of self culturally and who he wants to be, and how that impacts him in the here and now, you know. And it's just been, for me, it's been really beautiful to see it through this thing, you know, because a lot of time he just talked about stuff that's happened around his parents and their things and where they come from and a little bit. And, you know, because you can't go back no further. That's the sadness of it. That all you have, and a lot of time you don't get that message. For me, I didn't get a message. You know, in my training, I found that my dad was white Welsh. You know, I've got not my dad, my great grandfather was white and Welsh. So later on, that will transform to show you a little bit of history. Mindful of time, but I'm going to have to move on. Okay, so we talked about invisible cultural change, these beliefs that you might have. So there's thing that company come first before everything. That's from the Bangladesh. If you leave the culture, you will not survive. I find that with the Jewish community, there's a great sense, and a lot of my work with a few of these individuals, having them to acceptance they could still be in their community with these injunctions and messages that they had. So they didn't actually have to leave. Because a lot of the fear was because a lot of stuff that went home from there was a fear that they'd have to leave. You know, some of my working class was just get a job in council with Christina. I've talked about that. And a big thing in the English community, but in Caribbeans, with children should be seen and not heard. So you wasn't development of self. No, there was no development in self. So I know we've covered quite a lot, and I know it's quite a lot. And I always believe in an hour and 15 minutes is a lot to take in. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of put you in breakout rooms to sort of think about, sorry, wrong way. Think about what I've heard is going to be an exercise. And I'm going to put 3 questions up. I'm going to leave them up to think about you. And then I'm going to put you in the breakout rooms. And what I want you to do in them rooms is just to take time to think, you know, the questions, think about your experiences, how they are, how they impact you in the visual, what ways you adapted. Maybe I'll put the questions on now. So think of ways you adapted your cultural identity to fit into a new culture. Examples, it could be a new workplace, moving a new town, country, or joining a new school. What are your internal experiences, thought, feelings, physical sensations? How did you behave in these situations? Think about. What parts of you may have been rejected to fit in? So accent, clothing, you know, think about the parts of you that might be rejected. So we're going to look at this next bit. So you can come in if you want and think about some of the questions. Well, because as you can see, what I've got the next slide is social acceptance, you know, and like, because I put this once on my last thing, who cares what I do? Who cares who I am? I won't go into it because I've got a bit to cover. But sometimes I feel it'd be so simple not to care, you know, sometimes. My daughter says, without caring, there is no sharing. You know, she always says that. You know, she say that quite a lot. And we do care what others think. We want to be socially accepted, you know, and it's hard. How do you keep a sense of self with this? And how do our clients keep a sense of self? A sense of who they are and their culture and who they are, to feel that they can be accepted. So I'm okay, you're not okay. element of it. We talked about a cultural adaptation of personality due to historical subliminal cultural message and the possible historical feelings of shame and guilt. Black people can be perceived as aggressive and sometimes respond to these unconscious, unprocessed, undeveloped messages. You know, I use this example because it's from my own experience, you know, where, you know, if you think about them televised messages I give you, you know, in my household, a good example was my mum and dad talk really loud. And it sounds like they're arguing. If you go to a Caribbean market, you'll see it. They're talking and blah, blah, blah. And I took my friend the other day and he went, this is great. You know, but a lot of times our friends used to go, why are they arguing? But it's not. It's just the way that we speak. So it seems like, you know, it seems like you're aggressive. It seems like you're angry. It's really, and so what happened to a lot of black people, they found they toned themselves down. Like I said, Mo Gilligan's a really good comedy, you know, what he said, he calls it the second voice. You know, my brother has it beautiful. We're talking away. Yeah, what's going on, bro? The next thing, hello, how do you do? You know, we talk about this adaptation of our personalities and how they are. You know, sometimes what happens, it stops you responding in what you may need to say. You know, and I said that thing earlier, these all link in. What doesn't get spoken about gets acted out. So you imagine having to keep quiet all your lives. You know, we saw that with the George Floyd thing, with people up there and smashing up places, you know. I'm not saying the behavior is right, but if you're suppressed, you know, it's, you know, you suppress someone long enough, you know, they're going to attack. They're going to think, even though you may suppress them again, they're going to attack. So it's how do you find the voice, you know? And going back to my glass box analogy around not having a, all right, yeah, not having a, being stuck in somewhere and not having a voice. We talk about culturally, personality adaptations, and I look at that through generations of people. You know, you could even, I'll give you that exercise, but I talked about clients whose parents came here from different countries. So what they've done, they changed their names, they sent their children to a really good school, and there was a lot of pressure on the child to adapt and change, become different. You know, and I work at the hospital, I get a lot of clients through that because it's not who they are and not fitting into the culture. So it's really important to look out for the personality adaptation. So through this adaptation, we got things called, you know, they talked about repressed cultural ego state, you know, and I've talked about anger. I use black people from my own experience as a child, you know, the repressed cultural ego state that we've had to repress in order to survive and how that sits there. And when in considering interracial environment, how it can be stored in the body as a defense and how it can be stored in generations. Because in slavery, they wasn't allowed to speak up. They wasn't allowed to argue, wasn't allowed to shout. When they did, you was beaten, you was killed, you know, you was annihilated. So you think years, generations later on, and my parents used to come to you people are so wild ages ago. You think a second generation Caribbeans, you know, and a bit, not to say criminal behavior weren't good. These my ancestors would never get into trouble hardly, maybe back home, but a lot of them were well to do good. You came here and you found these people who had a voice, who talked, and your parents go, be quiet, don't make too fast. You know, so we talked about these repressed cultural ego states. And in communities, how are they repressed? So how are these repressed in each community? And it's really important to think about that, you know. And anger, I talk about anger being an energy. It's how you manage this energy in a more positive way, you know. And Fowley talked in her thing I really like, she talks about focusing on the self, the individual lash out and threaten another. And we see that with cultures. When they're being attacked, they either go into each other or they lash out at others. And I think in the Black Caribbean, there's a lot of lashing out. The rioting, the looting, you can see that not even in the Black culture. I think I was brought up in Brixton, I said in the 80s, and you may have thought the rioting was of lot. It was black and white together, just repressed communities who had had enough. You know, not to say it was positive, but it was there. So these you think about cultural protective self, and these just ways of culturally protecting yourself, defending yourself, I call it. Okay, so the full self, we all know about the full self. So I really talk about that myself. As long as I speak the Queen's Cockney English, I will fit in. I adapted the full self. You know, I clearly was not white. I'm hanging around with British movement skinheads, you know. One of them was quite famous. He's died now, so I suppose I can mention it. he had a band called Combat 84, but he was my best friend. And when he died, I sort of on Facebook, social media, I put his name. And all these people were going, well, how does he know him? But we brought up. And I realized this was my adaptation. Even though I was black outside, I had this thing I got earlier, and I adapted and I changed and I spoke English really well. Spoke it so well, these people forgot that I was black. Because I remember once we was driving along in London, and there was like two skinheads either side of me, belt braces, two in front, big, muscly guys. We're driving in a Jag, and in London they pulled us over in the West End, and the police got out and they put me to the side. In them days, I don't know, it's really weird, but he pulled me to the side. He said, "Are you okay, son?" And I went, "Why?" He said, "You're in the middle with four skinheads." And so he really looked at me, and I said, "But they're my friends. These are my friends." And it was really weird. And there was instances like that when I reflect on, when I see how I adapted so much. I created such a full self. Believe me, and the saddest of it, it went that deeper. Sometimes, I'd be with friends, and I remember I was talking to about a friend the other day, and we'd go to I remember going out once and going to a club, and we was all going to go in, and then all of a sudden this bouncer said, "He's not allowed in." And I went, "What?" And I looked around and sort of looked around, and then they went, "Because he's black." And I clearly forgot about it. Another time there was a National Front march, and they just used to go, and the police going, "No, you can't go in there." So that's how deep my full self created. I actually forgot, my skin color, and actually forgot, and the sadness of that at times, in order to survive. I share them stories with you, not just as an antidote, just how deep this can get with your clients, how deep it is when you've got the client in front of you, and to try and think about that and understand that. Okay. So, yeah, and Fowley talked about securing a false sense of okayness. You can see clearly that just gave me a false sense that I'm okay. Now, how sad is that to think that what you believe in, your views, your thing, they don't matter as long as I can feel okay with you. As long as you let out me in your group, even if you caught my race, you scale. Because I remember that sadness again. Well, them jungle bunnies, but you're okay. They used to go to me, and the sadness of that, and just having to go, well, okay, I need to fit in with society. I need to belong here. There's nowhere else for me. Because you think about it, I didn't know the Caribbean. I'd never been there. So I had to fit in here. I had to belong here. And how powerful was that? So I was willing to lose parts of myself to belong here. Like the sadness of it now that I think about it. And then we go in deep and we think about the internal unconscious bias and the splitting personality. So I think about the two parts of me, clearly when I'm talking about, and I give them examples. So I put a thing that we call Oreo. So black on the outside, white on the in, I sort of understand that now, interestingly. If I think historically, I think I've got a white grandfather somewhere up there, great grandfather, and I've got a black grandmother. And I think handed down, I think I got these chemicals. It'd be easy for me to think, so I would have that split, wouldn't I? I'd be black on the outside, but I'd be more easier to acclimatise there. And I think that makes sense to me now unconsciously. Well, I was able to fit in because I had friends who just couldn't fit in. They said, "I'm not hanging around with them white people. I can't fit in." They just weren't accepted. People just weren't. But I was accepted. It was really weird how I was so accepted in all these different cultures and things. So I think about that, the internal unconscious bias and the splitting personality. And I think about that a lot, how that's there. And I think about that with client. What components are here in the client, and how can I try and help them bring both components in and able to work together? It's going to look in a sense of that. So the next one I'm going to is quite personal to me, and it's to my brother, the two of us growing up. So we talked about adaptations. I talked about the adaptive child and the rebellious child. I used the concept to make sense of this, aspect in coming in. And I'm using me as the adaptive child. My mother used to get hand down these messages. We wasn't allowed to go out and play in the yard. We wasn't allowed to play. She'd go, "Don't hang around with them black people. They're dangerous." It's really confusing. We were black. you know, but we go and see our cousins. So don't hang around with black people, they're dangerous, you know. But the message handed down to me is to keep away from them. So I become a quite adapted. I listened to her and I behaved, you know. And so for me it was what I'd done, I mixed mostly with white people. That's what I'd done. I had hardly any black friends. I had 7 friends in school when I went to school. They were all white. And I'd go to all their houses and be there and fit in and thing. I I spoke English. I didn't speak patois. You know, there was no patois with me. Then I can speak it what happened and what gone. And I speak it now to my kids around because I need them to know that. I wouldn't speak it. I spoke always English. I adapted to the new cultural demands, you know, eating pie and mash, doing all these things, you know, going to all these, listening to punk music, listening to Pink Floyd. I adapted to all these new cultural demands, you know. I really changed myself. You know, I've got this eclectic taste in music. It was beautiful, but I did, you know. I was more passive aggressive, you know, more quiet, didn't say nothing, get quiet, didn't do nothing, you know. For me, I was quite reserved and quiet. You know, there was a sense of reservedness, shyness. I still have it, you know, that ego state. Not, don't put your head above the thing. Don't do this. I'm using my brother as the other example as a rebellious child. So he mixes mostly with black people. All his friends are still black today. You know, he's got his crew. I'm friends with him now, but he's got his crew. All his friends are mostly black, you know, and you'll hear him sort of talking about white people as they're different, but all his friends. He speaks patois and English, but mostly he's Caribbean. What's going on? What go on? He speaks it all the time, you know, mostly and then he puts his other voice on when he's around. He disregards cultural demands. So you wouldn't see him eating pie and mash. He still does it now, you know, but Gregory's got into it, but most is Caribbean food, you know. He does it tonight. He'll eat mostly Caribbean food, doesn't eat English food that much. He is perceived as aggressive, my brother. He isn't, but a lot of time people perceive him as aggressive. You know, really got this way about him, you know, where he talks in the Caribbean talking, you see it as sort of way about him and how they are. People see him as sort of a little bit more aggressive. And the last thing, he becomes quite manipulative, even with me, he's quite manipulative in the way that he gets me. Like he's with someone, you'll see it on the phone. It's really beautiful English to get what he wants to someone. Then it come off and he'll curse the person, call him an idiot, a fool, you know, in his Jamaican patois. So these are the adaptations in the development of the new cultural self that I say you create, you know, and understanding how that cultural self is created. And it's determined from factors of the past. Talk about them intergeneral meshes, them ghosts that are there that are being handed down, that impregnated. And sometimes, like I said, going back, the impregnated, how you change it. Oh, okay. So I'm ahead of time. So then we talked about, I talked about in my research, I started talking about mental health aspects and how that impacted. And I started finding research of how people change. My own experience, you know, my brother, as children, I got experience, as children, we moved from Brixton, we moved out to a place, Twyford, near Charville, Sonning, near Reading, predominantly white area. I went to school, it was really sad. I remember going into school sometimes and someone called me Coco. And I ended up having a fight, you know. And I asked them why they call me Coco. He said, 'Cause that's what we call the other bloke. Called Coco, you're black. That's your name. He talks about moving into this other cultural area, you know, and the difference, it didn't do my brother well. He really struggled, you know. Me, because I had adapted so well, I fitted in, you know. I sort of done. I thrived out there. I enjoyed it. I really liked it. I mixed in with the normal people in it. I got into a scrambling school. I found people that my brother got into fights, you know. He really struggled. He got into trouble, you know. He smashed half the estate down once on a thing. He really struggled with it, you know. And I could see he was really struggling with who he was and his identity and knowing it. It was really sad to see at times, you know. And what happened was in separate schools. So talk about what we talk about in this is your ethnicized identity. You know, and research has shown that schizophrenia was high in Afro Caribbeans living in prominently white, predominantly white areas, and they showed this. And I thought about this in essence to, a lot of mental health, we do have mental health in Caribbean. I'm not saying there ain't. But I thought the difference with some people coming here and how they, their mental health was impacted, in coming from, we think about the oppressed, Caribbean and the oppressed, and you're coming from a country where everyone looks like you and all belong, and you're coming from a country where in the history somewhere, there's a deep sense of oppression. So you're with the oppressors. And in a sense, in the early stages, you're being oppressed. My mum talks about getting spat on, getting shouted at. And I was out there and witnessed it, being called, I heard being called names, kids. I don't mind sharing with you. My mum's first child looks white, and what happened, and the gentleman who she'd had the baby was white, stall over in Brixton. They had to separate because it just couldn't happen. And she had to give the baby up, So, and she suffered, my mum had mental health issues. She suffered depression, anxiety. We went into children's homes a couple of times. So it was really sad with my mum's history. I ain't brought in a lot. But the mental health, imagine having to give up your child, just because she looks a different colour to you, but she's your child. She came back later on when I think she was about 16, she lived with us. And that was really weird for us because in the 70s, a white girl living in the same room as two black children, and the impact on her. And shortly after that is when she went off the rails, my mum. I can't imagine how that impacted her, that mental health, having to give up a child, not acceptance. But there is loads of research that showed that it was higher in people living in white dominant areas. And they talked about being around others, feeling the sense, feeling part of, And it's really sad because I've got people who work in psychiatric centres, and a lot of them are filled with Afro-Caribbean, in these individual places, working these therapies, and not getting better. So you can see, and you get that, it's like when you build these environments where people are not getting better, you see it. I've worked in groups for years, and I work at psychiatrists. I've been in a group where one person's really ill and the whole group gets ill, and it's really work to try and get better. Sometimes they call it the anti-group. That person has to go for the group to get better. But imagine that when you're in a group and you're feeling suppressed, there is no sense you getting better. There is no image of the other. There is no mirror to change. So imagine the loss in that. Imagine how that internally, affects you internally, mentally. So it's really something to consider when we think about our things. Sorry. The next thing he talks about is in the stage of cultural shock, the person experiences more complex states of mind. They're dominated by confusion and disorientation in relation to what is expected from others and what is expected as an individual, a sense of disconnection from one's surroundings. And that was up as 2018. And my mum was found, I don't mind her history, it makes sense now, was fine walking the streets one morning. First time we was put in we were sent to foster parents for a year, and the second time was put in a children's home, she didn't know who she was, disconnected from her culture. She never spoke to us about Barbados. I didn't even know I came from Barbados because I've got a Jamaican dad and a Barbados mum. And I thought I was Jamaican. I thought my mum was Jamaican because she spoke it. I always knew there was a twinge with the accent. My mum's other sisters had a different accent, but it's really weird. I go back as deep as to say, I thought my brother was my uncle when 7 years ago, I found out, this is all the fragmentation. I found out I've got 4 different other brothers and sisters, Caribbean, I'm speaking to, So that's how deep it goes. My mum disconnected from everything, from her past and her history, on a deeper level from the surroundings even, yeah. Okay. And so this is just another one. My patient is suffering from an inferiority complex. His psychic structure is in danger of disintegrating. Measures are taken to safeguard him and gradually liberate him from his unconscious desire. And that was from Fanon, because I like Fanon's readings, are beautiful. He talked about this early on. And it's interesting on my training, it was interesting that he wasn't mentioned. All the trainings I've done, I've done a 6-year degree. We looked at some, we've done a bit on diversity. I'd done this bit on diversity, someone came in. I had to seek for it myself around this stuff. And he talked about black face, white mask. And if someone had explained to me that years ago, I'd have understood who I was. You know, it really made sense. I'd have understood who I was around that mask, that white mask that I created, and made sense of it. You know, and that's something around being lost. You know, because he talked about moving. He talked about a really intelligent man. This was around living in France, living in French, oh, the, another part of France, but in Africa. And then all of a sudden he was brought to the motherland and thinking, I'm going to really do well in here. And he struggled. He really struggled, and I had to sort of bring him back because he just wanted to die. He didn't know he was going to survive there. And that really stood out for me. And I felt like that at times being a child. How was I going to survive in here? You know, and it was just by adapting and losing parts of me. You know, and yeah, and it was really sad. It's only lately that I've sort of got understanding the parts of me that I'd lost. And through becoming a TA therapist, I've really got in touch with that and understanding them and how powerful them parts of me have been a therapist. You know, they are so powerful. That's who make me who I am. You know, and it was like Heather Fowley, I don't know, Carol Shadbolt. There was people on there I started hearing. I started going, Karen Minikin spoke today. And I started, them components make me who I are. The bits of me that I've tried to regress and try to get rid of are really influenced by, because they're the bits of me that can help others. And I've started doing it, whether you're white or black in front of me, it's been able to help. You know, and I'm going to go back to the Jewish group. It's a really beautiful group I had. This was a group who for years has suffered, you know, depression, anxiety, going back, and it's all confidential. One of them didn't get out of bed. He's a rabbi now. Gets up, the whole community. But it was just 5 people, and through that, accessing that part of me, it played out. I allowed them to access parts of them. I allowed them to be in the community. You know, I sort of this group. I had to finish my grad sadly because I moved 2 years ago, and also I felt the group had grown enough. You know, the group had gone into their adult and are able to set, and all the clients had, and then they're all 5 of them doing well. Even though one who we had to sort of not reject, but he couldn't be in the group because he couldn't access the group or where it delivered. They've all grown and developed. So I'm sort of going into that fair plan. That accessing the side part of me has helped me to help others. You know, beautiful. And I was really passionate, even though I felt a bit tired. And I thought, I just need to talk this, look at my theory, think about it, think how it can evolve and grow, speak it to the TA community, you know, because I think I know it started going, but build a community to try and understand around, you know, it's not just being black, it's being black and working class, you know, it's the history of your family and not having identity, you know, take them into pack because that's why your client might be sitting in front of you. If you can understand that, have that historical structural analysis of all that's gone on, your best place to try and work with that. And also think about your own historical analysis in that, in this concept, your own culture, where you come from, your own messages you may become. And so it's really important that you're both in the room, in a sense, with the others. I talked about the ghost earlier. So a lot of this replicates itself. It's sort of, you work, it also all makes sense as we're coming along. So that's the mental health aspects. So we've started on and we talk about the transferential counterferential relationship. So I put in here the unconscious communication that goes on. So we're looking at the aspect of ancestors of communication that they've sent to this client in front of you, and your communication. And I used Freud's thing here because I talk about, if you think about when I came into, because I trained as a counselor, then I trained as addiction therapist, which was quite fine. So I wasn't telling you my script then. It was okay. You can be a counselor, you can be an addiction therapist. You know? Got my own understanding of addiction, my own history of addiction, I tell you. I don't mind saying that you could be them things. And my little script told me I could be them. To be a psychotherapist was such a struggle. You know, for years I wanted to do it. You know, I went to Metanoia in 2002, had therapy, and I thought, I want to do this. Could I? No, I put it off. No, I can't do this. I shouldn't be doing it. I'm saying this because if you think of psychotherapy, most of the forefathers of psychotherapy were white, sort of European. You've got Byrne, you've got Freud, you've got Folks. It's interesting. I found out Folks, his name, he was German, and he changed his name to adapt. Even he had a cultural adaptation. Folks, you got Boyne, you got all these people have got, but they were all white, young, Gestalt, you've got all these therapists, they were white European. You think all the research was based on, there was some research on some of other cultures, but I've seen it was an add-on. You've got their own history in the room, their own therapies that gone on. So you think about the unconscious communication, and for me as a therapist, it's really difficult. Now, I've got a couple of supervisees, I've got friends. I've got a friend who's doing a Gestalt training at the moment. It's very difficult. And that thing of difficulty, whether it's conscious or unconscious, of not being able to get in, or not being able to speak to people, or setting yourself up to fail, coming into the realms of TA, and even now I thought to myself, have I got a right to speak? Karen Miniker, she's a little bit lighter than me. She can speak all this stuff. Can I say this stuff in the room? Will I be annihilated? So we think about the unconscious communication in that. It's really important to think about all this is at play. And so I talk about how does psychotherapy and analytical cultural parent, the white Europeans, influence modern day therapeutic relationships and practices. And we have to hold that in mind because it's there. We can't say, no, it doesn't. We can't say it doesn't play out. We can't say that, no, we've all changed now, because my experience, Manoia, it's a lovely institute, but at times I found it difficult. My friend's experience from my other friends from the group and analytical things have all had difficulties, feeling like we can't communicate at times. What can we say? What can't we say? Can we say how we really feel? Will we reject to say what we feel? Can we write a paper saying this stuff? Is it too radical? Too radical to say. So these are aspects of stuff that go in. And so in that, at the bottom of this iceberg that I put on, thinking about projections, confusions, and projected identification going back to time and how they play out, a little bit. I haven't put loads of theory in it, in here, but there are theories that will add to this with my new theory that's added onto it. And you think about it. So these are all sort of things to consider. We're nearly there. It's been a long lot of information, so I'm going to give us some time to wind down with some questions. So my next thing is important. So I talked about a culturally influenced approach is the things I use. My sort of therapies I use is culturally influenced therapies. Culture is really important with and you can use this with anyone. How do you have a culturally influenced therapy to try and help people? I talk about having a shared language. How do you get a shared language? We've got our two different languages. How do we get a language combination together that we can both speak, which is fundamentally important? I found out of all patients, how do I find their language? Okay, maybe from German, how can I make sense of their ancestors' language so we can both bring it to the room so we can make an understanding of what's going on between us? Oh, sorry. It is important to continue raising culture consciousness, but to be mindful of being influenced by the unconscious motives of others when we talk about shared language as well. I'm talking about that. So we can understand that the ghost may influence. Great Indians talk about how their ancestors influence what's going on. So be mindful of that with your body in the room. I'm a great believer in using everything in the therapy and trying to sense what's going on. But also eventually, because I remember a lot of mine in therapy, I was trying to get you to reject me. That was my unconscious motives. I remember when I first group, it was I'd come out of all this stuff that happened to me around beatings. I wanted you to reject me. And what the group, they wouldn't reject me. It's really weird. Every time they were really nice and they explained to me it's the way I delivered it. So be really mindful actually there and understanding why they're saying this. Okay, what they saying it and what's the purpose of it, and how can I use this in therapy? The next thing is compassion is a loving self, concern for another person's welfare, be accepting of others' views, opinions. It's important to lead by example. This is really very, because I've heard, because you can hear some cultural things like beatings and that, and you can say, oh, that was really bad. Be really mindful, because that's like, I call that jumping ahead, you know, because people done that. I remember going to therapists and they're going, how bad was that for you? I shut down, I closed down. And it's really difficult because for me, I've learned through psychotherapy, I can't kill off my mother. You know, I mean, yeah, I can't actually kill her off. And another therapist can't do that. I have to do it myself. So I have to hold the good and the bad. You know, and sometimes it may be, oh, the beans is terrible. And I can realize that, you know, it's no good. It's not really, you think you're being compassionate, but what it can do with your views, it can distance yourself from others. For me, it took me a long time as a black male in therapy. I can't tell these people things. They're gonna think of us as a race, look at me a culture. And a deeper message might be you instigated at the beginning. If I'm to be honest, it got instigated from the white forebearers, you know. It's really important to recognize that for me, so it doesn't get acted out, and for the person who's seeing the black individual, the individual from a different culture. Things getting a bit so okay. Oh, sorry, go back. Sorry, my thing's playing up. And so I like Burns' thing, the fishing license metaphor. He provides a license, but the patient needs to engage a process to find their truth. And to create conditions created by therapists that the patient can discover their truth. But all this process and theory I'm giving you, you know, hopefully through it you can create a space with all this cultural influence therapy or approach, so you can create a space that the person can find their truths. That time I gave you, the one with the cab, from me creating that space, he finally created some truths. He created some potency, all the words used. He created autonomy. He realized, going back to TA, we have a choice. Think about oppression and that alienation. You don't think you have a choice. As a child, I didn't think I had a choice to be me. I thought I had to adapt. I thought I had to get rid of that part of me. You know, that's why I became a TA therapist, because I like the concepts of it. Voice, autonomy. You know, I like the word script. You know, I like that thing, the injunctions. It all run true for me, and I can see it all through my culture. And there's culture scripting, which is really important. I can see how the cultural scripting, I can see why the crypt was created culturally to survive. I always have this thing with my clients. I was taught to survive, not to live. You know, biggest thing for me, I was taught to survive. You can't just survive in life. At some stage in your life, you've got to stop and start living. And that was fundamentally important for me, you know. How do I start living, you know? It's only in these last few years that I started to live. And through that process, I can hand that on to my children that they can start to live. As a child, I was taught to survive. It didn't help me. It didn't give me choice. It didn't give me autonomy. Put me in the I'm not okay position, you know, all through my life. You know, so it's really important. I don't know if it has made sense to you. It's just a theory that I work on, you know, my own experience of it. You know, there's nothing radical. A lot of it has been done, but it's just my experience, yeah? And it's just how I work, you know. Just I think it's culturally influenced approach is so much important. And it doesn't matter, it's not about culture. It's not about, I say, black, white, it's about who have you got in front of you. As I said, I have a client the other day, and she's got an eating disorder. It was really interesting. We was talking in a few sessions, and then we talked about her Italian grandmother, who's slightly really nice and warm, but how her grandmother couldn't speak English. So she learned all these languages. She done that with her daughter. She made her daughter's married this English person, and how in the expectation of the daughter to fit into the culture, and how that has led to the only thing she's got in control is her eating disorder. And it's really interesting. I'm thinking that approach just works here with someone who looks totally British. You know, you wouldn't go against it. You know, so it was interesting, this approach, and my approach when I use it in a lot of my practice and how I've developed my practice now. I found it really beneficial. So I hope it's just beneficial to have me. I hope it's beneficial to TA, you know, my influence approach using the concept. I hope this workshop's been beneficial to people, you know, how it works. And there's no more slides. I think the only is my food for thought slide with depression is being colorblind and constantly told how colorful the world is. And I like that. You know, I really like that. And so, yeah, when people sort of say, not to say, but you hear that in the concept of, I have black friends, but it's just not about having that, you know, it's opening your mind to others. They're really opening up. Okay. So, because we've all got our prejudice and biases, you know, we've got them, they're there. That ability to admit them. And once you admit them, the conversations happen and change happens. You know, change happens beautifully. So I think that's really sort of important.